that in many corners of our life, in many corners of the Jewish experience and the global experience, there are lots and lots of reasons to be very sad and depressed and to feel downtrodden and to feel like the world isn't for you as individuals, as people, as community. And there's something here about the struggle towards smiling, the struggle towards an experience of joy.
So you have the Hasidim who actually puts pleasure as a center part of religious life. But I mean, all in all, I have to insist that for me, religion is for and foremost all about prohibitions, not about pleasure.
In some way or another, we are regularized and regulated to have joyful moments in our day to day. And we can easily forget that if we're not careful to bring those moments of gratitude and smiling and togetherness into our tradition, into our day to day. Welcome to Really Jewish. Welcome to our conversation about what it is to be really Jewish with Yair Eldan and Oliver Joseph. I'm the religious one, apparently. Yair is the secular guy. I'm from the UK. He's from Israel. Welcome back, Yair. It is really great to be this. You know, we're doing this podcast about what it is to be really Jewish, and then we're meeting a little bit less together at the moment. But then I think when we come back, then we have a lot more to talk about because it's a pretty substantive topic, what it is to be really Jewish. And today, it's a Sunday, it's a fast day in the Jewish calendar. It's the 17th day of Tammuz, and we're talking about pleasure and prohibition as two pretty enormous topics in the Jewish tradition. So welcome back. Welcome to our visitors who are coming for the first time. Bruchim Ha'Baim if you're listening for the first time, and welcome back if you're here for another lesson. And welcome to Yair Eldan.
Hey, Oliver, it's good to be here. It's good to be back.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about, we've been running for a couple of months now, the podcast, and it's one of the topics that we've put to the front to prioritize, talk about. Why is the aspect of pleasure and prohibition kind of featuring heavily in your version of what is really Jewish? And let's start with pleasure. Why is pleasure important in the Jewish tradition?
First of all, I like that you actually separated pleasure from prohibitions because, you know, the Western culture and also I think Paul itself said that there is a deep dependency between pleasure and prohibitions and fun and prohibitions but as to your question, and I'll be happy to think to your question. As a kid growing up in a religious home, I felt always that there is something about religion that is opposing pleasure. I mean, that pleasure could come in a very small dishes, small amounts. But the main thing is the prohibitions. The main thing is the difficulty. The main thing is the discipline, the confinement of what you feel inside you. And I think something about this very basic, simple feeling as a kid, it became a very, very central aspect of religion in my mind. It's not true. I mean, when you talk about Jewish culture and religion as a whole, that there is an opposition to pleasure. I mean, I can't see that. But if you're talking about my existential feeling, I grew up in a home that, and I think there are a lot of Jewish religious homes like that sees fun, that sees pleasure as a problem. And as a secular, I have a totally different view about the subject. And it took me years to actually enjoy life as it is. I have a feeling that you don't relate to what I said as a religious rabbi, but and I will be happy to hear you because I'm curious about it. Do you have a different, it's a feeling. I'm talking about a sense of fun and pleasure in your religious life, and I have a feeling that you have a different view about it. But I think you can see, I mean, alongside the Jewish culture, history, that pleasure is, part. You're supposed to be happy. Literally, that's amazing when you think about it. V'samachta b'chagecha. Be happy in the festival, in your holidays. And you have to be happy and to have pleasure in wine and meat. I mean, and obviously you have the whole 18th century Hasidim who were opposed to all the, the vector of prohibitions and seeing religion as a kind of, as I sensed it as a kid. So you have the Hasidim who actually puts pleasure as a center part of religious life. But I mean, all in all, I have to insist that for me, religion is for and foremost all about prohibitions, not about pleasure.
Right. So it's interesting to kind of carve a way through that distinction. If we're talking about bad pleasure, exactly as you said, we're commanded in the Torah, for example, around Sukkot, to be ach sameach, to have an aspect of festival which is solely joyful or solely happy. And I often think about when we describe the festivals, that the festivals are just kind of agents or elements of the year, that it's on Sukkot that we learn what it is to truly celebrate. And that aspect of Sukkot is then translated somehow into the rest of the year. It's not that the festivals, each individually, that we mark moments in that one festival which are exclusive to that moment in the year, but rather we learn archetypes of human behavior inside each of the festivals each year, and then hopefully carry some of those architects and aspects into the rest of the year. So Sukkot is Ach Sameach, and Purim is this aspect of like wildness and frivolity as another example of where you might find aspects of joy. I mean, it's the mitzvah of one of the minhagim of Purim is that we won't know the difference between the Rasha Haman and the good guy Mordechai, the wicked Haman and the good guy Mordechai. That's a real shrunken state, but it's associated and connected with frivolity and joy. I guess also to draw a line in the sand, exactly as you said, that there's something quite like mitnagdik in the way that you describe your relationship with joy and prohibition, because there is an aspect of this 18th century kind of hangover where these Hasidim, these ecstatic Eastern European Jews who were reinventing what it meant to live a life of happiness and joy, were significantly, severely opposed by probably a good chunk of the other population, the remaining population in that part of Ukraine, Eastern Europe, Russia. And so like one of the dividing lines, one of the lines of turf, one of the lines in the sand between those communities was how you experience joy. And I think what you describe, I feel like, is like some like leftover of that debate, that in some parts of our Jewish community, specifically like the quality of being like dour and downtrodden and Haredi, like trembling and almost, verging in a negative context, fills your life to such a great extent that that aspect of joy is significantly limited. And I find that sad. I find that sad because it feels somewhat out of balance, but I don't think your experience is alone. I think my experience of pleasure in the Jewish tradition is that there's lots of it. I didn't grow up in a house like that, partly because my house that I grew up in was somewhat not observant, so there wasn't that sense of awe inside the mitzvah. And I think particularly my late mum of blessed memory, whose yahrzeit was last week, she really approached Judaism from a place of opting in. So as a place of positive kind of connection rather than any sense of shit. I have to do this. And that's joyful. So the Shabbat and Friday dinners with like the full table of people, as we often did in our family home growing up, and the festivals, and even changing over at Pesach kind of felt somewhat joyful, even though it was a lot of work and a big commitment to take on. I think joy is, in my life now, I think there is something of obligation to the mitzvah and how weighty that can feel. And, today I slept for 2 hours because one of our kids was up early, and it's now a fast day. And that doesn't feel great. That feels somewhat oppressive. It's going to be a hot day, going to get on the train here to go to work. And there are parts where prohibition comes in strength, but we'll get to the prohibition in this conversation. I think the prohibition does have a role, but the aspect of happiness and of joy is at the front of what it means to celebrate. That in some way or another, we are regularized and regulated to have joyful moments in our day to day. And we can easily forget that if we're not careful to like bring those moments of gratitude and smiling and togetherness into our tradition, into our day to day. What's your thought? What's joyful in your life, Yair? And how does that work in a kind of secular context in terms of making sure those moments happen and making sure that pleasure is solidly part of your life, even if you're not keeping the mitzvah in the traditional way?
I think the main word that you used actually in what you said now is balance. And I think there is something about religious life that is not balanced in a way. There is something about religious life that is the equilibrium between fun and prohibitions. Fun and discipline is being in a way damaged. I think when I think about my pleasures in life, and there are a lot, as a secular, I understand today, I mean, in my age, that before, I knock myself out, I'm going to, to drink with friends. I understand already as a secular that I'm going to pay a price tomorrow. And I have to actually make sure that the price is not being, I'm not going to harm myself or my loved ones. So I have always this, I have to make an account of what I'm doing, because I'm into all sorts of calculations. And in a very, I think, paradoxical way, Oliver, I think that makes me feel pure pleasure. After I do the calculations and I understand that I'm going to enjoy a very beautiful art, painting, or I'm going to read a wonderful story by Philip Roth that I'm reading now, American Pastoralia by Philip Roth. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and I enjoy it a lot. And also just enjoy, sex, enjoy just to touch another person because of the calculations, because I have to make sure that the pleasure is not going to harm myself or others. I actually can sense pure pleasure in what I feel. And that's what I told you about the festivals. And you actually said something else. You said something that is beautiful, but I don't think I disagree. You said that the joy in festivals, the command to be happy in the festival, is actually an archetype. It shows you how to be happy in your life, everyday life. I disagree. I think religion is kind of, it takes from your hands the calculations that I actually spoke about, and the religion gives you outlets during the year. You're right. Purim is, the outlet, because, you can do everything. And actually, that is the archetype, in my view, of what religion actually relates, how religion relates to fun and pleasure. Because, when prohibitions control your life, your everyday life, you have to let go couple of times a year. And when you let go, you don't care about your loved ones or to harm yourself. It's an outburst and something about it. That's what's so amazing about my age. Something about this outlet. I mean, because you're not there. The pleasure is not pure. In Hebrew, there's an idiom. I love it. To be tzaruf. Tzaruf is an atzufa is pure pleasure. It's clear, pure. How do you say, distilled in a way? There's something about it that is very, very powerful.
But they actually disagree on these terms, because if we take Sukkot and Purim as two of the paradigms that we're describing, Sukkot feels more in relationship. Sukkot is about sukkah, about temporary dwelling. Sukkot is about the arba minim, the unity of different parts of the self. It's about feasting. It's about celebration of the harvest. It feels much more in relationship with the world. And so it is a calculated joy. Whereas the aspect of Purim, I think, is actually more dangerous. And we were actually talking about this in a little bit of the preparation backwards and forwards. Purim is the aspect of jumping off a bridge. I mean, God forbid, but it's the aspect of I've been repressed for all of this time, and now suddenly I'm going to let go. I'm going to get so hammered, I'm going to get so drunk, and I don't even know my own name. That's the modern day of government. The idea that we should not know the difference between the wicked guy and the good guy is I'm going to get drunk till I don't know my own name. And that's not in relationship. It might be that it's important in the tradition, in the different festivals of the year, of which we have many, that you need to have a Purim where that kind of letting go is permitted, because we need that letting go. I can lots of moments in my year where I need moments letting go. When I go for a run, that's my small way of just letting go. I often have no phone. If my phone's with me, it's off. I don't listen to anything. I don't talk to anybody. That's my letting go. That's my jumping out of reality into something else. But there's also a danger there of needing happiness or that kind of joy, that joyful release to such extreme tones. So Kot feels more in balance. And I think I'm more in favor of the Ach Samech, the Simcha, or the pleasure of Sukkot, which is also in relationship with the world that we live in, versus the Purim, which feels like more of an outer-body experience, which, listen, we have both. We have lots of people who, for example, use drugs quite regularly and really have a regular out-of-body experience in that respect. And you could make the argument that kind of escapism is really important for the human soul. But as a rabbi, as a spiritual leader, I feel like the related and relatable regular pleasure on Eid Shabbat of like being with family and friends and creating community on Shabbat and experiencing pleasure is a more healthy way of doing it than like the extremist version, which is to head for the hills. What's your take on that?
Yeah, obviously, I think there's something about Jewish life, Jewish religion, as all religions, that it tries to give you a good way of living, balanced living, of a healthy living. And obviously in Shabbat you can see it. There's a pleasure of that you all sit together on Shabbat, and it's there in the biblical text itself. It's just there. And obviously the prohibitions are there as well. I mean, there is something in a way, when I read the Bible, there's something more balanced in the religion at its origins. In the origin, there is something more balanced. As you go forward, I feel that the whole prohibitions became more prominent. And as a result, that's what I said, there's kind of a addiction to pleasure with religious people. I mean, because they don't have the responsibility of doing this equilibrium, doing this calculation themselves. They actually, when you look at a lot of about religious life in Israel, I can actually say I look at religious people, and to my disappointment, I can see that there's something addictive about the way they live, and it's actually counterintuitive. They're supposed to be religious, so they're supposed to be more balanced. But when you look at how they treat food, eating, and how they walk in the world, I feel that there's something not healthy about the way they live their lives. And I think the basic balance between pleasure and discipline and prohibition is one of the basic learnings, something that a grown-up person should actually, learn about himself. But I remember, as a religious young person, Oliver, I came to Haifa, I remember. And first time in my life, I was after the army. The army is something else. It's kind of a microcosmos. But I learned to actually live with secular people. I was still religious, and to my astonishment, I saw that there is something about them that is more even conservative from my religious counterparts. They actually live their lives in the balance between prohibition and fun. Actually, the scale was more towards prohibitions with the secular. I was amazed. And I asked myself, how could that be?
I'm interested. What's an example?
I mean, they were not so keen to go out at night, if there's studies tomorrow, they have their limits, while the religious guys, they party like there's no tomorrow. That's interesting when you think about it. And I'm not for that. I think that's also not balanced. But when the responsibility is from in you, it's on you, I think there's something else. And when the responsibility is not on you, there's something that disconnects you from life, from the world. I can see it in Israel today. I can see it all around me with religious people. Something that is, they don't have to take responsibility about this balance. And so everything that is actually allowed, you should do. I mean, because it's allowed, it's not prohibited.
Right. But it's interesting because all we're getting to is that the prohibition and pleasure aspect that's inside the Jewish tradition is in many ways a reflection of who we are as human beings, of a human temptation, of a human stance, of what it is to live. So in many ways we balance, in the secular or in the religious context, what we are doing is balancing core parts of ourselves. I wanted to get onto the text that we spoke about. It's Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was also a Chassid and from the 18th century and one of our more popularized teachers of this spiritualist Chassidic tradition. And very famously, he says, mitzvah gedola liyot b'simcha tamid. It's a great mitzvah to always be in happiness or in joy. But this is the important part, the less quoted part, the second clause and the continuation of the teaching, the great mitzvah to be happy always, and make every effort to, in this translation, to determinedly keep depression and gloom at bay. The reason why it's interesting to have a teaching in all of that we said about how Judaism is a tendency to be dour and a tendency to encourage solemnity and seriousness. It's interesting to have an aspect of the tradition which so wholeheartedly calls towards joy and pleasure. And this is an example of that. It's not a sole teaching, it's a key teaching that people often allude to. But in the Hasidic tradition, one of the parts is ecstatic experience, and to drink and be joyful, particularly around Shabbat and festivals, to a certain point where, take off and find yourself at one with God and at one with your spiritual sense and your spiritual self. But there's another part here, which is kind of the second part of the teaching, which is, I think it's pretty well known of Rabbi Nachman, that he struggled with his own mental health. And there's something here about what it means, mitzvah gedolah liot b'simcha tamid, to be always happy. I think in some way or another is a description of the personal struggle that in many corners of our life, in many corners of the Jewish experience and the global experience, there are lots and lots of reasons to be very sad and depressed and to feel downtrodden and to feel like the world isn't for you as individuals, as people, as community. And there's something here about the struggle towards smiling, the struggle towards an experience of joy, this constant strife which it is to remain on even keel. And that bit I'm really interested in as a rabbi and as a religious experience and as that, constant striving towards balance. What's your take on Likutei Moran, the Rabbi Nachman teaching?
Listen, I mean, you're so right. To deal with depression and anxieties, I mean, in Israel in the last 3 years, it's a lot of people around me, myself. I had a long time. I wasn't depressed, but I was down for months. A lot of people around me have anxieties. Even people are taking medication to treat and a therapy to treat it, and I'm saying that because there is something about what Rab Nachman said, the two parts of his sentence that are actually contradiction. I mean, they can't live together. I mean, the command or the religious demand to be in simcha, and the saying that you should have an optimistic feeling, not to dwell into your sadness. I think there are two contradictory. Why? Because what I said before, because there is something, how do you deal with anxieties and depression? You have to actually, it's a very, very long, difficult process. There are no shortcuts here, no shortcuts. You have to speak about your difficulties. It's not enough to have an optimistic way because it's not just a cover-up of what's going on inside you. You have to make a big effort, and people who do that, and I can see it in my work, people who actually commit themselves to this, they go back to life. People who are, just covered up with mitzvah gedolah liot b'simcha tamid, ken? That's how I see the Rab Nachman, the people who in Israel, the Breslavim, Oliver, they have this car, this van, and they stop in the street and they start dancing, and I always feel they're so sad. I can see them. They're sad. They're outcast of society. They have a lot of, you see, that they have a lot of suffering inside them, and I feel sorry for them. So there is something about it that it's not connected to what it means to be really human, if I can take what you said before, because it's a universal, tension between prohibition and fun. So there is something about the way religion treats depression and anxieties, I think, that is not, I don't see it in the biblical text, but I can actually see it in the more rabbinical, there is something. They mean well, I think, but result is not with connection with human needs.
What you're describing there is interesting because it's something about the essentialism, like the essential nature of what it is to, the description of the Rabbi Nachman teaching is about holding balance and to be in relationship with both. He goes on to talk about happiness as a cure for ill health. And there's something there about somewhere in us is always this possibility for sadness and for deep malaise in some way or another, like a darkness. And the aspect of grasping towards joy is really important because that is in part the cure. There will never be a moment in our lives, in many people's lives, let's not don't have to universalize everything. For a lot of people in this world, there'll always be reasons to be sad.
Sure.
The loss of a loved one, your debt, your addictions, you name it. Between us, we have 100.
Mm-hmm.
But the possibility is also to reach for that place of joy and to strive towards that. I often think of, it's a slightly different archetype, but the image of Joseph in the caves of Egypt, of the dungeons of Egypt. And Ketz Yomim in Parshat Miketz, in the middle of Hanukkah, we talk about Joseph waiting for 2 years to get out. And I think it might also be Rabbi Nachman says that we have to have mabat le'olam haba. Like there's something about like that spiritual gaze, which also comes from the Kabbalistic and Hasidic tradition, where we're constantly like with an eye on that human need, on the possibility of some kind of spiritual redemption. That doesn't mean that we don't come from prison, we don't come from a dark place, but the resilience is that gaze towards what's possible.
I think it's a wonderful example. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about the prohibition. Does the prohibition have any role? This is the bit that you least like to talk about, but like, my appreciation of your Jewish life is that perhaps it's a too simplistic version, but you shed some of the tough stuff, the prohibition parts, and you get to enjoy some of the good bits. Maybe that's an oversimplification of your experience of Jewish life, but tell me about your understanding of prohibition in your own life and in what's really Jewish.
Listen, I understand what you said about Nachman. I like his seifa. The end of its saying is actually wonderful. I don't like the mitzvah gedola yot besimcha tamid, that there is a command to be in simcha. I think it's superficial, and I think it's not surprising that religion connects in a very deep way between prohibition and pleasure. It's not surprising that Paul says, as I said in letters to the Romans, he said that for a part from the law, sin is dead. I mean, there is a connection because for Paul, actually, sin comes out of the law. It comes out of the prohibition. The pleasure is actually dependent on the fact that there is a prohibition. And actually, Freud also said this. I mean, that there is something about the prohibition that actually produces the sin or produces the pleasure. But in my secular life, it's not like that. It's not like that. For me, as I said, it's more like an equilibrium. It's not that they're producing each other. They have to be in a connection with each other. They have to, they have life of their own. I mean, prohibitions for me are not prohibitions in a way. I don't feel them as prohibitions. I feel them as, treating other human beings as I treat myself. I mean, the categorical Kantian saying that you should do everything as treat the other person as you treat yourself. Your interests are not better than the interests of others. And I think I don't feel that it prohibits me. I have to be with reciprocity with other people. I have to connect with them in a way that not harms them. So there's no dependency in my consciousness between pleasures and prohibitions. There's a kind of flowing. There's kind of understanding that I have to be in the world. I can actually enjoy myself, but I have to make sure that I don't harm myself or others. I mean, the metaphor is more fluid, I think.
Right. No, I don't know. I think it's actually very complicated. On one level, the prohibition is God ordained. Like I do relate that to that part of the tradition that there's something divine about this body of commandments. But, the uniqueness, but it's not unique. The distinction of my journey is I came to religion from probably quite a tough place. My mum had just passed away, and I came towards this tradition, like a train hurtling towards the station. It was something. It's a dramatic image, but like I came towards it, I guess, from a place of need. But it's been more than 20 years on that journey as a religious person, and when I have this conversation with you, I have like kind of pangs of. Is this this is an interesting take that Yair has about, the role of prohibition. Is this what I want for me and for my family? As somebody, looking opposite me, as somebody who grew up in this tradition, I wonder in my own life about what the choices are I make and the significance of them. But the aspect of prohibition also guides. An aspect of prohibition also gives structure to my life, which I enjoy. I enjoy the parameters, the clear parameters of the way that I live and the ebb and flow. So it's hard to frame. I don't want to live a life where I'm terrified of the repercussions of not doing stuff. I don't think that's a healthy way to live. And I think it has to be a balance between the two. But I also want to wave the flag in a world where, in many parts of the secular world, anything goes, that there is a role to being guided on this journey by ways of law and restriction.
I mean, there is a very common view on secular world that it's a world with no limitations, and obviously there is part of the secular world that it's true, kind of hedonism, nihilism that controls this secular world. That's not my existential being in the world. I always have to make sure that I balance. But I think you're right. There is kind of or parts of the secular world that won't be, damaged if they would take on themselves a few prohibitions from the religious world.
Right. Listen, it's an interesting conversation which will carry on between us because it's really at the core of some of this divide between secular and religious. Just interesting to zoom out, and a part of the interesting part is how we emotionally relate to what it is to live, both of us in many ways, inside this tradition, but inside this tradition in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's early morning here on the fast day of 17th of Tammuz. We're going to wrap up here as kids are wake up in our house. Thanks for listening to Really Jewish. We hope you got something from being here. Thank you to Oy Vavoy for our musical intro and outro. Listen to their single Back to My Roots streaming platforms. We are really happy to be here. Like our posts and share this podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're interested in supporting this project, click on Patreon and donate monthly to support Really Jewish with Yair Aldan and Oliver Joseph. Look forward to having you back next week. Thank you. Thanks, Yair.
Yeah.